that's a lot of the economic stuff. What happened to the oil? And when did, and how is, that's two questions. And how is Maduro different than Chavez?
So what about the oil and what about Maduro?
Yeah.
Okay. The decline in prices per barrel of oil in 2014 in the course of 1 month undercut the Venezuelan economy by about 50%. The Venezuelans are smart people and they're a sovereign nation, and they realized over the years that the oil would not last forever, nor was necessarily oil the only way that the international economy would work. And so between 2004 and 2013, when I would go there and take delegations, we always met with PDVSA, the state oil company, because they were also looking at alternative energies. They were looking at ways to bolster something that they would be able to begin to gradually replace an oil-based economy with. So when people would go there and they'd start asking them questions about green technologies or the environment or something like that, they were not unaware of any of that. It's just that in point of fact, the major income producer for decades was that. And that was not going to happen overnight. And it certainly wasn't going to happen overnight if they were also under considerable international pressure. And so what that did was play into a situation that already would have been a challenge, even though they were intellectually aware of it and smart people, but now it was also doing it in an even more hostile environment. And so at the moment, I think that still is where things stand, and the role of oil in that cannot be understated. Next thing, Maduro and Chavez. As I said before, Chavez was a larger-than-life person. He was smart and funny and feisty and strong and resilient. He was also one who was able to empathize with and connect with people. The women who would say, "This could be my son," they were simply recognizing the fact that he was the first president in Venezuelan history who looked like them, who spoke like them, who used their idioms, who came from a background that would understand them. Until Chavez, the presidents of Venezuela had my skin tone consistently. My skin tone consistently. And then Hugo Chavez came. And he looked like the vast majority of people. And he talked like they did. And he was one of them. So he didn't have to pretend. He didn't need people with makeup. He didn't need focus groups. They didn't have to tell him, if you want to sound like somebody in the working class, here's how you talk. He knew about that. And so he was interesting, but also a captivating kind of figure. Let me just reflect on the two times that I was on this. He had this weekly television program called Allo Presidente, and he would have this presentation, and then people could call in with questions from around the country. And so the program lasted 6 hours. It was live. 5 million people watched it. And 2.5 million people hated him, but they watched it because they hated him. They wanted to see what he would say that would make them even angrier that week. They couldn't break their habit. And 2.5 people loved it. 2.5 million. And so a 6-hour program seemed a little daunting at first. And when it wrapped up, I turned to the person who was translating for me. I said, "Is it over already?" Because he analyzed the international situation for 45 minutes. Then he would sing songs with a children's youth choir. Then he would hand out land titles to campesinos. Then he would quote from a book, and he'd say, "And because you can all read now, get this book and read it." He'd put the book down. Then he'd sing another song. Then he'd interview international guests. Then he'd bring somebody else up who had just got an award in the factory where he was. Then he'd bring up another book and say, here's another quote, you can all read, get this book. And he did that on average 8 or 10 times in the course of the program. To recommend a book, to remind them that they were now empowered to do that. And it was an amazing experience. And he was equally good, it seemed to me at least, at reading people. The international poets were having a conference there. He's talking to Ernesto Cardenal and other people about their poetry, and then he'd shift and say, and now we're going to get the youth choir from the St. Mary's Catholic Church here in town, and they're going to sing, and I'll sing along with them. And it was remarkable, because he was also a serious guy. And so I had the experience of seeing him twice and being interviewed by him twice, and it was a remarkable sort of experience. Nicolas Maduro was his vice president. Comes out of the same background of struggle. The opposition originally made fun of him because he was a bus driver. They said, you can't be a bus driver and be the president of Venezuela. Just like they said when Chavez ran in 1998, he'll never be elected, no one will vote for him but the monkeys. Good.
Was he not labeled as a little monkey
Hmm?
Was he not labeled as a little monkey himself?
Mm-hmm. And so that was the issue that came up. But with Maduro, it was because he was a bus driver. He does not have all those gifts that Hugo Chavez had as a person. But he was also trying to manage the situation, which was getting worse day by day. And so in Venezuela, if you ask people, is there corruption? Absolutely. Is there mismanagement? Absolutely. Are they being strangled? Absolutely. Has the bottom fallen out of the oil market? Absolutely. All of those things are true at the same time. And the question is there anything that U.S. intervention in the way that it has taken form over these 20 years, or the way it's sped up in the last 4 months, is there literally anything that could improve that situation by what's being done? And the answer is no. And so what falls back on us is a question of what our responsibility is in terms of allowing the Venezuelan people to settle their own problems, to make their own mistakes, to acknowledge their own triumphs, and they are intelligent, sovereign people. What I saw more than anything else in the 7 trips that I've made there is the dignity of people who actually believe they're sovereign and they have the right to make their own decisions, no matter who likes it or who doesn't like it. And sometimes those will be good decisions and sometimes not so good. But they actually believe, strange as it seems, that they have the right to determine their own destiny. And so at the moment, those who are in place are the actors who must settle all these things. And from my point of view, our responsibility is to make sure that we prevent, first of all, a U.S. invasion. Secondly, the U.S. using regional allies to create military problems there. Thirdly, that the sanctions be attacked as what they are, collective punishment. We have to remember that May 12th, 1996, Leslie Stahl was interviewing Madeleine Albright on 48 Hours, or on 60 Minutes, and she said to her, the last 2 people overseeing the sanctions regime against Iraq have resigned, saying it was criminal activity. Do you believe that 500,000 dead children as the result of the sanctions are worth the cost? Important moment, May 12th, 1996. And Madeleine Albright said, you know, I do believe they are worth the cost. Let that settle in a second. The sanctions that have begun in earnest against Venezuela have the same potential for doing that kind of damage. And that's why that needs to be proposed.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Reverend Clark, thank you. We're so fortunate to have the story of Venezuela told today at this church. And I hope it's the same with Belmont-Watertown, that they're getting the same information because of what's going on today. But I just want you to bring it up a little bit to the present. In listening to Telesur, which is the worldwide satellite that every single person in this room could watch the media from Venezuela if you want to, on satellite web. It's telesur.com, and you can get directly what's happening in the world. And what when I say bring it up to the present, I'm talking about 750 tons of Chinese medical supplies are part of the whole thing, as well as Russia has now taken to represent Venezuela on the world stage. Now, one more thing, Tilly. One more thing is that throughout all of the countries of Latin America, whether it's the El Quds demonstrations or whether it's Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, they're all, when they're in the streets, there are tremendous battles throughout Latin America, and Venezuela is at the center. Do not invade Venezuela, U.S. go home. And this is happening throughout, but it's very important to know that. So you left us a little bit of a doom in terms of the strangulation, in terms of everything depends on the USA. Well, maybe you could bring out a broader possibilities there.
Right.
Sure. Can go down sometimes.
Wait.
During the period when I was.
Just wait, will you?
I'm sorry.
Let him answer.
Let me at least respond. It may not be an answer. I think the point you make is a very good point. What I simply was saying was that in terms of not the first administration that we've seen, but certainly the administration, at least as I understand it, it would be possible for them to act at this point in ways that were not only cruel, but also irrational. And so despite the fact that there is opposition that's come about in the United States, but also, as you say, across the hemisphere, while that is very significant and very important, I think that doesn't mean that would veto the kind of actions that are apparently still on the table. And so the other thing that's, I think, very important about what you've mentioned, though, is that sometimes it's hard if you wake up in the morning and see there are 100 things calling for your attention. It's hard to figure out what's at the center. What's one of them that might have implications for everything else? And it may be simply because I have more of a connection with Venezuela over these 15 years. But I think that what happens there now has implications. That answers the second part of my question. Why does it matter? Because what happens in Venezuela now has implications for us and for every other country in the world, and especially for those in Latin America. When we began Witness for Peace in 1983 and decided, well, maybe we'll do something that had never happened before in U.S. history. We'll take U.S. citizens into active war zones and put them in a village where they're going to be attacked by the Contras that are paid for by our Congress, and let's see what happens. There were 37 wars underway in the world. And we actually sat down, some of us, and said, is there one conflict, the resolution of which, the outcome of which, has implications for every other one? Not that those other 36 aren't important, but is there one that's crucial? We took a chance and wagered on the fact that what would happen in Nicaragua had implications for everybody else. That was just our judgment. But I think for me, Venezuela is that country now. And so it not only is at the center of other people's demands in other locations, but objectively speaking, it also will have implications for the coming period of time. Thanks.
Hi, thank you so much.
Yeah, sure.
I really enjoyed it.
Sure.
I have two questions. One is, I wonder if you can just explain a little bit about the Venezuelan embassy ordeal. I know what happened, sort of, but I don't know the reasons, or I don't know why it's allowed to happen, or something like that. But also, regarding the sanctions, I'm wondering how they're enforced. I know it's like largely economic and through the financial apparatus of the world and so on. But like, we're not actually blockading, or are we?
Yes, we are.
And also, how does China, or how might China and the current trade thing and jockeying, including changing relationships with Iran and so on, how might that interact? As well as OPEC, that matters too.
Okay. Yeah, just very quickly, and there may be more recent information on the embassy occupation, but what began to happen there approximately 2 months ago is that the embassy is the property of the Venezuelan government. And so when both we and the Venezuelans expelled one another's embassies, staff, and ambassadors a couple of months ago, that meant that the embassy was left idle. But it would have normally been staffed by their embassy personnel. And so at that point, the pretend president had a pretend ambassador with a pretend embassy staff, and he was going to take over the embassy and now say, I'm the ambassador of the Guaido government. And so the administration was willing to allow that to happen. And then Code Pink and other allies occupied the embassy, were consistently mistreated by Guaido supporters outside as they would try to get food and keep the lights on and keep functioning inside. But then it was in mid-May that they actually were forcibly removed. And with the intention at that point, obviously on the part of Guaido and his supporters, for them to take the embassy. To the best of my knowledge, that's not yet happened. So the embassy is still not occupied by the self-designated staff, but it was an example of something that, nobody, I think, if we had looked at this 4 months ago and said, where are the points of contact that we may have as a movement? What would it be? You probably wouldn't have said, well, we could take over the embassy and keep the pretend president from having a pretend ambassador. But in fact, that's the reality that happened. And people moved quickly and wisely and bravely and did just that. And so at the moment, that's my understanding of where things stand.
I think Guaido's ambassador actually has moved in there.
Now he has. Okay. Okay. I was not aware of that. But they're always, and it's interesting to me that always with Gallo's humor, obviously at the heart of it, but frequently in Nicaragua and Guatemala and in Venezuela in the years that I've been there, they always have this sort of joke about a riddle. Why has there never been a coup in the United States? It's because there's not a U.S. embassy in Washington. and so that's sort of where things stand. Now, in terms of the sanctions themselves, this is not yet at this point 12 days of October blockade of Cuba from 1962. It's not at that point, but it's sanctions and the pressure that's been put on other countries in the world, and Canada seems some days to be more rabid than Elliott Abrams and John Bolton. Canada interested in, I think, the natural resources that are capable of being developed now, second largest gold reserves in the world, and of course the largest oil reserves. And so Canada's positioning itself, I think, for those opportunities in the future. But the sanctions themselves are making it very difficult for anyone who, because initially the European community was trying to think of a way that they might, well, can we still get medical aid in or something like that? But the U.S. is leaning very heavily on anybody who considers themselves to be an ally of ours. So the people who've broken the sanctions so far are China, Russia, Iran, Syria. Elliott Abrams has decided that Cuba, with all of their wealth and power, is actually keeping the Maduro government afloat. And it sort of came in from right field in a way that was odd even for him, but they've decided Cuba's key in keeping the government going. But they have been able to find allies who are willing to stand aside from that. And the other thing that's happened at the UN is there have been 3 emergency sessions called by the United States in the last 2 months, asking the UN to recognize Guaido and to say that Maduro is not the legitimate government. There have been 3 emergency sessions as the Security Council, all of which have failed to end the way the US wants it. But there have been those efforts internationally as well.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
I wonder what your view is of the 2015 legislative elections and the suppression of the National Assembly over 3 seats.
Right.
And not that this question in any way justifies what the US is doing.
Right. I actually think it's possible to come down on either side of that question. And I think there are Venezuelans who have come down on either side of that question. This was a decision by the Supreme Court of Venezuela to say that if the National Assembly allows people to be seated who are not legitimate representatives, they have now violated the covenant they have with the other parts of government and with the Venezuelan people. And so their responsibilities and rights were suspended and an alternative governing body was elected. I think it's possible, and it's none of my business, but I think it's, and so I don't have to make a decision about that, nor would I want to. But I think Venezuelans can look at that from both sides. The government looks at it from the point of view of if you allow people with a slim majority, and that would have been a slim majority, to be seated, then you've given power to the right. There are also legitimate reasons to look at it, so they did have those 3 people whose legitimacy as elected representatives was not an unmixed blessing. And so when that happened, there certainly was differing opinion within Venezuela. Now, Maduro has called for parliamentary elections to happen in the near future, not to wait until 2020. One of the quasi-demands of the opposition, which frequently is not unified in its demands, but one of the demands was elections immediately. They meant presidential elections, but what Maduro seems to be offering at this point is that we get a parliamentary elections and see who wins the votes. And so is that a way to not only respond to what's been said, but also countries in the world who may be on the fence? Is that a good gesture that would say we're trying to do something right in this? So again, that's their business. We could argue whether that's giving away the store, or whether it's simply caving into pressure, or whether it's simply the right thing to do. All those are possibilities. Until this recent stuff, though, I would have to say, Jimmy Carter's oft-quoted statement in 2012 that Venezuela had the best electoral system of any country in the 92 nations they had monitored